All right. Welcome everyone to today's Preservation Leadership Forum webinar, Shifting Perspective, Preservation in the Wake of Natural Disasters. My name is Priya Chaya and I'm the Associate Director of Content. As always, before we move into the session, there are a few logistics I want to share with you. We will take questions from the audience during the webinar using the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. You're welcome to submit at any point during the webinar, but we're going to wait until the end to answer the questions that come in. We also would love to encourage you to communicate with all participants using the chat function. Tell us where you're from. I'm from Alexandria, Virginia. The closed captioning function is enabled for this webinar. And following the program, we will send out a recording directly to the email you use to register, along with all the links that we share during the session. All forum webinars are available on our National Trust YouTube channel. So if for some reason you don't see the recording come in about 24 hours, it will also be on the National Trust YouTube channel. Finally, this webinar series is made possible by members of Preservation Leadership Forum, the professional membership program of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And we sincerely thank all of you that are with us today. So this is what to expect today. In a minute, I'm going to hand things over to my colleague, Sari Warden, to give a little bit of introductory remarks, after which we will hand things off to the wonderful Danielle Del Sol, who will moderate a conversation with Adrian Scott Fine, Hans Alhoff, Jesse Landel, and Jack Thompson about their experiences with Hurricane Helene and the recent fires in Los Angeles. So with that, I'm going to hand things off to Sari.
Great. Thank you so much, Priya. I appreciate it. Welcome, everyone, for joining today's session. I'm Sari Warden, a Senior Director of Preservation Programs at the National Trust. And before we get going with today's conversation and our fantastic guests, I just want to briefly position the work the National Trust is doing to confront what is one of the greatest threats to historic places and communities, and that is the increasing frequency of these natural disasters. In 2024, we saw record high temperatures contribute to massive flooding events, extreme heat, drought, hurricanes, and increasingly intense wildfires. And these events are becoming more common and just more destructive. And the impacts are undeniable. We see communities across the country, rural, urban, suburban, coastal, inland, facing these threats. And I think we also know that many of our cherished historic places are in harm's way. And at the National Trust, and I'm sure many people on this call would recognize, preservation is about more than protecting buildings, although that is very important too. It's about protecting the people, the stories, and the cultures that they hold. And that's why this work is so personal. In many ways, it's very difficult. We see that with our own staff. We see that with our partners, including many of you here today, who are living through these challenges and aftermath. We see the damage, the displacement, and we absolutely hear the urgent call for action. And I will say, over the last few years, the Trust has been responding to these increasingly common climate impacts through advocacy actions like our very well-known 11 Most Endangered program with listings in Boston and Jamestown a few years ago, through partnerships with the National Park Service on places like the Tidal Basin, which floods twice a day, every single day, and through numerous grant programs, including the Maui Small Business Recovery Fund and many, many more. And I would be remiss not to mention our amazing government relations team, who has long been advocating for federal disaster relief and sustained preservation funding. And we're going to keep doing this important work the best that we can in the current times we are in. And looking ahead, we are really excited to also build out a new Resilient Heritage campaign. And that campaign is focusing on two main areas. The first is reuse and retrofit, which is being led by my colleague, Jim Lindberg. We're producing guidance through that program that's going to help homeowners improve energy efficiency of their historic homes. At the same time, we are pushing for policies that align preservation and sustainability. That work is underway, I'm really excited to say, and you'll hear more about that soon. The second bucket is resilience and recovery, which is very much the topic of today's conversation. And through this effort, we are looking at a number of components. We really want to help these community anchors that are legacy businesses prepare and respond to disasters. We also want to position our 27 historic sites and landscapes as models of sustainability. And we absolutely want to help support communities with resilience planning. All of this we see combining into what we're calling our resilient heritage resource hub, where we can share tools and strategies with the public. So we're in the development phase of much of this. We're gathering feedback, working with local partners, and of course, looking to raise money to do all this important work. So we're really excited about it. This is important stuff. Preservation plays such a significant role in community rebuilding, and I'm really happy we have this great group of people to talk about these issues today. And now I'll turn it over to Danielle Del Sol, the Executive Director of the Preservation Resource Center of New Orleans. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sari. It is such a pleasure to be with you all today. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope that this webinar brings you information, inspiration, ideas for things that might be happening in your communities or just that you would like to get involved elsewhere. My name is Danielle Del Sol. I'm the Executive Director of the Preservation Resource Center of New Orleans. And as we approach the eve of the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, there's a lot to reflect on in terms of what a preservation organization or what a community at large can do to recover in a way that prioritizes saving and bringing back historic sites and neighborhoods and the quality of life that a community of people deserve. To refresh those of you who weren't glued to the news 20 years ago when Hurricane Katrina hit, like many of us were, Hurricane Katrina came ashore on August 29th, 2005 as a Category 5 direct hit hurricane over New Orleans. And while it caused significant damage, the true devastation happened in the hours that followed, which was when the levees broke and flooded a majority of our historic city with feet and feet of water, completely covering certain neighborhoods, but causing substantial damage to the majority of our historic city. And so the recovery that happened took months and years. And really, it's only been in recent years that we are out of the recovery phase. But I did want to just remind people as we talk about that, that the infrastructure and the way that our infrastructure can fail can have exponentially larger effects. Though a natural disaster may be an impetus, the constraints that we have built around us to keep us safe might not hold. And so the Preservation Resource Center was integral in helping our city recover. And there were boots on the ground in the days after the storm that lasted a long time. The National Trust also sent staff to help, which we are eternally grateful for. But we did a lot as an organization. We did a huge variety of things to aid in the recovery, and they were varied. And they're significant to note. Just a few of these. We literally had people helping gut houses for years after the storm. We ramped up our number of AmeriCorps staff members, and people would go out every day gutting houses, rebuilding houses, and helping hundreds of families return to their homes here in New Orleans. So that was a huge part of the recovery work that the Preservation Resource Center did. We documented buildings across the city, and that aided us in later efforts to advocate to save as much as we could. What we found was that the workers coming in to help FEMA document and demolish buildings did not understand the materials we used here in New Orleans and did not understand what could be saved and what needed to come down. So the Preservation Resource Center staff had to work almost every day in those early years after the Hurricane Katrina to fight to save buildings that were slated for demolition, but absolutely did not need to be demolished. Significant buildings, but also just homes that made up the character of our beloved neighborhoods. So documentation and fighting demolitions was a huge part of what we did. Because there were so many demolitions regardless, we also opened a salvage store in that time where we would take materials from the demolished properties and resell them to people who were coming home and rebuilding and needed materials for their historic homes. And this worked beautifully for many years post-Katrina. In the years since then, since the immediate recovery, we have experienced a number of hurricanes, but thank God the response post-Katrina from the federal government was bipartisan and it was very generous. We got billions of dollars to rebuild our levee system, and we are safer than ever before in terms of our levee infrastructure. So thankfully, the hurricanes that have hit in the years since Katrina, while there has been significant damage, there has been nothing to that degree again. And so the PRC has pivoted. You know, it's been 20 years. We're not doing immediate recovery anymore, but we still have threats of wind and flooding that are pretty constant. Every summer, we have some sort of named storm, though it might not be a direct hit. We definitely have the threat of hurricanes every year. And we do have flooding that can actually even happen just during a rainstorm. So we're constantly working with residents, hosting classes to talk about things like how do we fortify houses against extreme weather without damaging their historic integrity? How do we elevate houses? Should we? How do we retain water on site to prevent flooding? So these are conversations that are ongoing and really comprise the work that the PRC is doing at this moment. So I am very excited to moderate this discussion with all of that past behind us and all this work ongoing. And I want to introduce our panelists here today. Adrian Scott Fine is the president and CEO of the Los Angeles Conservancy. Hi, Adrian, welcome. Could you please introduce yourself to the group?
Do you want me to do the full introduction, Danielle?
You know what? Let me introduce everybody else and then I'll hand it over to you.
Okay.
Okay. Hans Alhoff is the chair of Altadena Heritage. Jesse Landell is the executive director of the Preservation Society of Asheville and Buncombe County. And Jack Thompson is the Western Office Regional Director of Preservation North Carolina. Thank you all so much for being here today. I can't wait to hear about what's going on in your communities and your insight. So Adrian, why don't you take it away and introduce the work or what's going on in Los Angeles right now?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Danielle. And thank you to the Trust for convening us all. First of all, I'm, again, President and CEO for the LA Conservancy, and I'll just provide some brief kind of context. We're pretty newer to this issue of natural disasters, especially this type of disaster. I'll provide a little context. So last Monday, or this last Monday, was a 3-month anniversary of the fires that started in early January. And I would say it feels simultaneously like 3 hours ago and 3 years ago already. And just to give you some context, we had up to 5+ fires burning in early January, though it was really the Palisades and the Eaton fires that primarily caused the main destruction and loss. And to give you broader context, LA County is quite large. So we're over 4,000 square miles in size, 88 cities plus unincorporated parts of the LA County. Our organization covers all of LA County. The fires themselves encompassed more than 36,000 acres in size in terms of the burn areas, and over 16,000 structures were lost and 30 fatalities of human life. And you're also, to make it more complicated, it's multiple jurisdictions: City of LA, Los Angeles County, and in 3 other cities in terms of Malibu, Pasadena, and Sierra Madre that were impacted. And as Sari said at the very beginning, from the start of these fires, it's always been about people first, then places. And I think also as we're talking about natural disasters, it's very personal in terms of inherently it's a part of trauma, it's a part of grief, and there's no right way to respond or recover. And that's, I think, very much where we're at right now in terms of Los Angeles. I was just going to share 4 what I would say observations in terms of where we are now and how we're trying to meet the moment of recovery. One of those is that this new sense of Angelenos and beyond feeling the collective loss of what this means in terms of the impact of these fires, and honestly a new profound sense of what places and spaces mean and how they matter to us. I think we as preservationists inherently know that, but I think that has changed for a lot of people in Los Angeles. And whether it's losing your own personal house, which is profound, or a capital H historic place like Will Rogers Ranch or the Zane Grey Estate that were also lost, or a beloved legacy business, we're all understanding that in terms of what do physical places mean to us as a kind of destabilizing experience, and just understanding how important those are. Another observation I would say is that we take our historic places for granted. I don't think this is something new that we didn't know before, but this is something even myself, I have experiences when looking at these fires. We are now learning about, or we have learned about places and spaces that were lost in the fire we didn't know about beforehand, or they were places we intended to visit and never got around to doing it. And I think that is, again, another profound aspect in understanding why historic places matter, especially when you're looking at the face of disaster, a natural disaster like this. And I would say the media has been a really good partner in helping to tell that story about why heritage matters and why it matters as part of recovery and rebuilding. Another aspect is that, and I think it's more profound here than maybe in other communities that are experiencing natural disasters, is it's definitely, when you talk about heritage, it's more than bricks and mortar. We knew this before, but it's more apparent now, especially when we're talking about most everything in the burn areas are completely gone with rare exceptions. So we don't have a lot of buildings standing. We have fireplaces, we have chimneys and that kind of thing. So it's cognizant upon us as we talk about recovery and what is the role of heritage and preservation, is in some ways we're redefining how do we acknowledge heritage from both the tangible and the intangible cultural assets and attributes and values, and also how do we identify and hold on to these aspects and engage communities in these conversations as part of rebuilding. And I think that's in many ways a shift from what we traditionally think about when we're talking about the work around historic preservation. But I think it's critical in terms of this and the work that we're doing right now to ensure that, one, we're being relevant, but we're also meeting people where they're at in the moment, certainly the aftermath of these fires. And the last point I would share is that we're still very much in the chaos stage now. We're only 3 months into it, so conditions are changing almost by the week, and rules and leadership and who's doing what. But I will say, overwhelmingly, the response has been everybody wants to help. People are coming together. It's kind of a beautiful thing to see Angelenos all working collectively and figuring out how they can do this. And it's bringing some creative, innovative ideas already to the table. And even the way we're thinking about our work, and I will acknowledge, the National Trust has been helpful in providing us some funding so that we could do some initial mapping. The World Monuments Fund has also provided some funding. As we've been documenting, you saw some of the images there of some of the, being able to document both for the Palisades and the Eaton Fire areas, all the heritage assets that were impacted. So we at least know that, and now we're talking about where do we go next, but I'll stop there. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Adrian. That's so interesting. So staying in Los Angeles, I'd like to introduce Hans Alhoff with Altadena Heritage. Welcome, Hans.
Thanks, Danielle, and thank all of you. Thanks, Adrian, for that excellent introduction. My name is Hans Alhoff. I'm the chair of Altadena Heritage. Altadena Heritage was born in the mid-1980s, initially just to do historic preservation, architectural preservation work. I think over the years, it has evolved to focus on all things stewardship of place. That word place is very, very important to us. I think more so than the word community, which we often use. There is a tremendous amount going on. I can speak to what Altadena Heritage is working on now. Obviously, what we're talking about right here. So historical preservation, historical education is a huge prong of the work that we're doing. A second prong of the work that we're doing right now is we're very, very interested in planning. And what I mean by that is that amidst all of the devastation and destruction, a lot of us see an opportunity to really engage with urban design thinkers, urban planning thinkers, to talk about what an Altadena 2.0 might look like. That's very, very hard work. It's very, very forward-looking. It's also a little bit fragile to talk about that with respect to Altadena, because one of the most enchanting things about it is that it feels very unplanned and it feels very spontaneous. And we are at the end of the road in LA County, as it were. And when you use the word plan, it can give people the impression that you're going to lay out their environment for them, which is the opposite of what we want to do. Nonetheless, we think it's very important to have those discussions about planning and design and how we can bring in people to help us navigate through those questions. The last thing Altadena Heritage is really focused on, and Adrian made this point really well, Altadena is and I know a lot of our audience is not in Southern California. Altadena is an unincorporated LA County. So we are not an incorporated entity. We don't have a local government. We are governed by the LA County Board of Supervisors. The supervisor whose district encompasses Altadena presides over a humongous district. I'm from Washington, D.C. If you look at a map of the district that encompasses Altadena, it's like looking at Washington, D.C. on a map of the United States. Our supervisor is Catherine Barger. She has created what she's called the Altadena Recovery and Rebuilding Commission. And within that, there is a community coalition for Altadena recovery. And Altadena Heritage is serving on that, and I represent Altadena Heritage on that. The last thing I'd say by way of an introduction, and it's more of a confession than an introduction, I am not a planning professional. I'm a lawyer. I'm the chair of Altadena Heritage, became the chair, as it were, almost the day after the fire. I love this work. I love learning from people like Adrian, but it's not what I do professionally. My origin story actually is I'm a trail runner, and in 2019 I ran an ultra marathon that finishes in Altadena. We start in a little mountain town called Wrightwood. We spend 24, 36 hours hustling across the San Gabriel Mountains. The race empties out behind NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, enters into Altadena, and the finish line is in Loma Alta Park. So my identity as an Altadenan is very, very rooted in the mountains. My sense of who I am, my sense of what Altadena is, has everything to do with the landscapes that we inhabit. I think of Altadena, or I would like to think of Altadena the way that someone like Edward Abbey thinks about the Utah desert. Very, very interested in that sense of place and that sense of identity of place. It's great to be here. Thank you again, everyone, for attending.
Thank you so much, Hans. Your unique perspective is really wonderful, and it will enrich our conversation for sure. So let's switch coasts and go from the West Coast to the East Coast now to talk with Jessie Landel, the Executive Director of the Preservation Society of Asheville and Buncombe County. Welcome, Jessie.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, so here at the end of September, Hurricane Helene hit. It started in Florida and then moved all the way up into Western North Carolina and parts of Tennessee. It's considered the worst natural disaster in North Carolina history, killing over 100 people in the state of North Carolina and causing widespread damage, of course. In Buncombe County alone, we lost 43 people from mudslides, flooding, downed trees. In addition to structural damage, to give you an idea, 40% of the trees in our county are thought to be either down or damaged. And in Asheville, we were without water for 53 days after the storm. The water lines that were washed away were buried 25 feet underground. So having grown up in Florida, I kind of thought I understood hurricanes, but a good friend of mine pointed out, in Florida, your house might have been washed away, but here the land underneath your house was also washed away. In the days after the storm, it was hard for us to find our footing as an organization and figure out the best way that we could help the community. But very quickly, we focused in on 3 areas. So the first of which was dehumidifiers and generators. It was such a simple thing. And we just got in our cars and drove them all over the county and gave out over $10,000 in dehumidifiers in just the first couple of weeks. And then the second thing we did was we very quickly pivoted our grant program. So we had an existing grant program where we did small, modest grants up to $5,000 for people that included a bricks and mortar category. So immediately following the storm, we opened that up for people that had had hurricane damage on a structure that was 50 years or older, with the thought that $5,000 was not a lot of money, but it was fast money. And so while people were waiting for FEMA and they were waiting for their insurance company to respond, we could get somebody a check for $5,000 within 2 or 3 days. And to date, we've given out over $275,000 in those small grants. So that was a big part of our response. And then the third thing was we began a volunteer-led rapid survey. There were a number of parts of our county, especially some of the more rural areas, where historic surveys had never been done. And so we knew there were some areas that the structures were already gone, but in a lot of areas they had been very badly damaged. We knew that there was a threat that they would be lost really soon. And so we wanted to get out as fast as we could and start identifying those places and photographing them and documenting them, both as a way of understanding what areas needed our support and also documentation before places were potentially lost. So those have been the 3 areas that we focused in on. And as of today in Asheville and in Buncombe County, people are still displaced from their homes. Businesses are struggling to reopen. Our area is extremely dependent on tourism. And even though parts of our city are in really good condition, we've still struggled to get that tourism back. And so folks aren't visiting here yet. And that's something that's a big push for our area. And every day we are seeing announcements of more and more businesses closing, even businesses that didn't actually have storm damage, but have been affected by the aftermath of the storm. So that's kind of how things stand here today.
Thank you so much. That's fascinating, Jesse. And congratulations to your organization. I mean, you guys, that's very organized. 3 things.
That's all we had the energy for.
It's very impressive. I mean, those 3 things are very impressive things. Okay, thank you. Jack Thompson is the Western Office Regional Director of Preservation North Carolina. Welcome, Jack, and we'd love to hear your perspective.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, National Trust. First things, I'm the Western Regional Director for our statewide nonprofit PNC, but I'm also from the mountains. I'm born and raised in the Asheville area. And so it really does hit home. My brother went without water for those 50 some days. I have parents in elder care, one with dialysis needs, and the dialysis unit completely flooded. And so now we're busing folks, 100 miles away that have critical medical emergencies on a daily basis. The Western region for PNC comprises 37 counties. 25 of those were part of the declared disaster area. As of April 2nd, there were 107 fatalities. In fact, just last week, the remains of the latest fatality was discovered. This area, as you can imagine, it's mountainous. You've got communities that are on what we call high dry ridges that, were not affected that much except for these loss of utilities. And then you've got the communities that are really down on the river's edge and the creek's edge. There's a romantic notion of the dark hollow up in the mountains of Appalachia and the isolation that is there. And even the small babbling brook became raging torrents. Our infrastructure was, decimated. Today, we're rebuilding roads. A lot of the transportation network in the Appalachian Mountains relies on the topography that is adjacent to a body of water because of the level nature of the flow of water. And so countless miles of roads have been lost and they're slowly coming back. Countless bridges, both public and private bridges. In our state, the political administration at the state level did not undergo a traumatic or dramatic change politically. And so it was kind of status quo from one administration to the other. So the initiation of emergency funds from Raleigh, it took longer than it needed to be frank about it, but it was also just the general nature of things as far as getting decisions made at the political level to start the emergency funding efforts. We're 6 months in. To echo some of what Jesse had said, we're starting to see on the ground level a lot of the the traumatic response, personally, both, from our colleagues, but also the folks that have been resilient and have kept the stiff upper lip and, really charged through a lot of this challenge. And so the need for professionals to help address the emotional trauma that's come along with the storm, aside from the physical trauma. And there's kind of an echo, a dichotomy between the cultural values versus the built environment and the historic values. That's, in my estimation, what needs to be addressed the most at this point in time. It's the lag of emotional response from the trauma that we're starting to see now. And I hate to be the Debbie Downer about it, but that's really what's happening. And I'm glad to participate. I appreciate the invitation.
Thank you so much, Jack. That's such an important perspective, and it really does broaden this discussion so importantly, that this is not just about individual buildings. These are about people and their lives and their homes and their family homes and generational homes. And that kind of leads to my next question, Jack, because you kind of gave insight into how recovery for you and your organization and your community has broadened in the past 6 months. I mean, for all of you, this seemed unprecedented. I mean, sure, there have been wildfires in Los Angeles, but this was so massive, and terrifying. And my gosh, a hurricane devastating Asheville. I mean, there are plenty of people in New Orleans who have, climate haven homes in North Carolina, and never in their wildest dreams would have thought something like this could happen. So this is a point that maybe none of you ever thought you would be in. And so can you talk to me very briefly about, after the devastation, after the fire or the storm, you probably felt like, okay, we need to do this. Your immediately response was, we got to do this to recover. You've now had 3 to 6 months since then. How have things evolved? What are some things that you've come across that broadened your perspective on what recovery means for your organization?
North Carolina is one of those states. It's kind of 3 states in one: the coastal area, the Piedmont, and then the mountains. And realistically, we get a hurricane almost every year, but it's on the East Coast. And that's not to diminish the effects in that area. It's more of a long, sustaining flood event that happens in the East Coast. We get snow, and we don't even get snow like Rocky Mountain snow. We get, 4 inches of snow in the mountains, and the folks that aren't from there kind of freak out and buy their milk and bread, and then it's over in 2 days. But we don't get those rains. And, ironically, because of the large tourism industry that is there, the large kind of second home industry that is there, there's a fair amount of Floridians that are also very used to hurricanes in the Appalachian or the Southern Appalachians around the Asheville area. I think that what we are seeing today, initially, because we weren't used to this kind of event in the mountains, from us professionally at PNC, and in our office, the Western office, we were very much like desperate to get on the ground. We're a 37 county region, and I live in the eastern part of that region. So I'm 2 hours away from even the foothills of the mountains. So it was like, I got to get in my car. I got to get up there. I got to see what it is. Well, one, if you can even get there, which most of it you couldn't. And two, it's not really, the professional historic preservationist isn't really the first person you want to see roll into your town after an event like this. I'll just be frank about it, right? And so that was a big part of the evaluation of how we respond within our own profession versus how we respond personally, and then with my own links to the mountains and how to navigate that. I think from Jesse and I have a very close professional relationship because of our overlap in careers. And I think that my observation is Preservation Asheville's response was really well timed, with resources in a very, tip of the sword kind of way, and in a delicate and emotionally responsive way. And that's kind of the difference between the local organization versus the statewide organization, who kind of has to be in a broader area. And how do we respond? You know, we are just now starting our kind of by invitation small grant program 6 months later, you know, and Jesse was deploying funds a week later or 2 weeks later. And I don't want to hyperbolize, and Jesse will speak to that. But now we have very firmly entered that round for PNC, where we know we can confidently deploy funds in areas and not be getting in the way of response, and that sort of thing. The other thing that I'll say, and this might come up later, is culturally speaking, there are very sharp dichotomies in the cultures of the Appalachian Mountains. So we have, been here and got here folks, right? And so a lot of the been here folks, when I am looking at properties that obviously appear to have need professional services of some sort or another, I also have to be very delicate in communicating within the community itself to say, does that person actually want to be approached? Because there's this kind of Scots-Irish legacy of isolation, and I'm hiding in the mountains because this is where I want to be, and I want everybody else to leave me alone. There's a big part of that too. So
very interesting. Yeah, thank you, Jack. Would anybody else like to comment on that question?
It was interesting hearing Jack, because he was 2 hours away and I was here, and he was wanting to get on the ground and I was wanting to find out what was happening, and we didn't have communications here in a lot of ways. So cell was down, internet was down for, weeks. It was really hard to get information. So, we too had to get out on the roads to drive around to actually find out what was happening, because it was so hard to get the information. I definitely had many misunderstandings. One, it took us longer than you would believe to figure out how bad things were. It was days of sort of realizing what the situation was and sort of uncovering everything that had happened. But I was like, we need to be on the ground offering technical support to people. No one needed technical support. It took just now people are starting to ask for technical support. Now that's what we need to be offering. But we had a lot of misconceptions about what the need was going to be. But I think the biggest thing I learned from it, one, I got some really great advice. There's a woman named Annie Rubel who is from Heritage Emergency Management, who volunteered her time and came to town and gave guidance to organizations like ours. And she said, stick to your mission. And that narrowed it so nicely for us that we were able to say, okay, 50 years or older, the structure has to be 50 years or older. It has to be in Buncombe County. And the fact was we couldn't help everybody. So this gave me guidance of who I could help. So that was really helpful. And the other thing I think we really learned from it is that we couldn't be perfect. We didn't know if somebody was going to rehab the house the way we wanted them to when we were giving them that $5,000. We just knew that we could help them dry out their structure right away. And so we just decided we're going to be imperfect about it and be okay with that, and move fast instead.
Good for you, Jesse. That's real. And that is what is needed in a moment like that. Adrian, I'd love to know your thoughts.
Yeah, there's some similarities. We're 3 months behind you all. But I think I will echo Jesse on the point of misconceptions about the need. I would say within the day of the fire happening, we were already starting to collect names and people that were willing, from like the structural engineering community, preservation architects, and many people were reaching out. What can we do? How can we help? Not just even in LA, but across the country. And we're like, okay, that's great. That's what we'll do in terms of when and after the fires for those buildings that are damaged. We can really mobilize and bring in those resources, and hopefully that will follow with grants and other kinds of things. That was a misconception in terms of we don't have buildings standing. I can probably point to a dozen across both fire burn areas of where we maybe have a facade, or we have a portion of the building, or in some few examples, we've got buildings where they were just partially damaged. And so that means, how do we respond is very different. in terms of that. I will also say that not a misconception, but it is a reality in terms of the resources that are available, and this is still unfolding, certainly as we're looking at this from federal to state and local, is that some of the places that weren't destroyed, in some ways, the owners feel like they would have been better off if they had been, because they don't have access to some of the same resources, financial or assistance, and they're still dealing with contaminated materials that they have to address, and they can't get back into their buildings, and they don't have that same resource. I think the other piece to this is that really finding our lane was part of this, and I think that is across the board, and I'm sure would echo that as well with Altadena Heritage. Is we're like, okay, we know it's about survey documentation, one, understanding what was the impact, but also what does that mean? And it is enlightening on a couple of points. One, the city of LA, we're very fortunate, has done a citywide survey. So going into the fire for the Palisades, we knew everything that was there. We knew where the fire was encroaching upon and what historic resources were at risk, like the Eames House and other case study houses. And we're watching those as the fire was still burning for multiple days. But we knew the resources and what had already been lost. And that quickly, that mapping was happening in terms of post-fire. For Altadena, it's different. There have been some survey efforts done in the 80s, some historic context studies done around the African-American community, but there were a lot of gaps and it was a lot of outdated. So our effort as part of the mapping was to understand that. But what we've learned is there was a lot of stuff that has been lost that we didn't even know about or beforehand. And now we also have, the whole other portion of the community that still hasn't been surveyed, which we would love to try to figure out how do we make that happen, because it's really critical as part of the rebuilding and knitting the community back together in terms of that. So I think that is a critical part of this, and saying, where do we bring value? Where do we bring the resources? But it's also, I think it's moving beyond just looking at a traditional survey inventory, but also looking at cultural asset mapping. And that is something we're very interested in thinking, how do you do that, especially when it's about things like, African-American community, generational wealth, people that don't have the resources to come back, but you want to encourage those attributes and those values that are really critical to the community as part of rebuilding. You don't lose those. And that's the struggle. And I'm sure you have all learned that in New Orleans or in other places about what does rebuilding look like and who's it for and who gets to come back. I think that is a big question mark that we're still struggling with right now. The last point I would say is, like I said, we're still in chaos mode. That's maybe not the best description, but there's lots of groups doing things, which is all a good thing. But there's a certain level of duplication. There's a certain level who's doing what, and that is still kind of getting figured out. And I think it's very different. The response is happening for the Palisades and the city of LA versus Altadena it seems to be a much different, hopefully more grassroots or bottom up in terms of making sure that their voice is being heard as part of the rebuilding effort and what that looks like. I'm sure, Hans, you probably have additional thoughts about that perspective too, and what you're learning too.
Yeah, spot on. And I saw Jesse nodding when Adrian spoke about potential for duplication. I would link something that Jack said to Adrian, what you were referencing, which is Jack referenced the babbling brook turning into the raging river. That is how I can tell you a lot of people here feel about the tremendous eruption of community engagement. On the one hand, it's a beautiful thing. It's obviously better that people are engaged and that they care than the opposite. The flip side of that is that you can just get lost in everything that's happening. And there can even be the potential not only for redundancy, but for community fragmentation, which is even worse. I mean, that's conflict. And I think we're starting to see some of that, if not explicitly. I think it's there. I think it's there implicitly. If what you're aiming for, and maybe this is just me speaking for myself, but if you're aiming for like epistemic mastery of a subject of the recovery, it's just impossible. There's just too much happening. There are too many things to tune into, and you can devote a tremendous amount of time to really tracking everything that's happening, but you're still going to come away just having to leave certain things on the table that you're not able to fully immerse yourself in and figure out. The other thing I'd say, switching gears a little bit on the preservation note, I can tell you how I think about preservation in Altadena. And the first thing to say is that a lot of Altadena's history was already history. So a good example of that is the Mount Low Railroad. This was a railway system that ran up into the very mountains that burned. It was built in the 1890s. By 1930 or by 1940, the mountains had eaten it alive, totally gone. It's just remains at this point. So that history is no worse off today than it was before the fire. And in some instances, it's even been brought back because with brush burning and erosion, you're able to see more of it. So that's one chunk, the older history that was already history. There's also history that we've lost that's simply not coming back. And that's where I think of things like the McNally Mansion or the Zane Grey Estate. We simply cannot bring those things back to life. And so as I sit here, all I can really say is I'm so grateful that I was able to live in their time and that I was able to have an opportunity to see those places. But they're gone. They're just, there will never be another McNally Mansion. There will never be another Zane Grey Estate. And so then the third category is what part of our heritage or history is still there and damaged such that we can turn our attention to as preservationists and preservation professionals. And I think that's where a lot of the most important work can actually be done.
Thank you. That's so interesting. To Jack's point earlier, professional preservationist is not somebody that you want to see on your front door in the hours after a disaster, but it's so obvious to all of us on this call why our work is so critical. That said, and especially, in like parts of Altadena where there's literally nothing left, it really shines a light on how our physical landscape knits us together as a community. And as you were saying, Hans, when that is gone, that the fracturing can begin, and that is so dangerous. And then the question that Adrian posed of, who gets to come back? Who gets to buy this land or restore these buildings? So all of this is kind of out there. We know that our work is critically important. Do you all find yourself being questioned about the value of your work at this time? Are you struggling to find support, or do you feel like the public generally understands that you as an organization have to be visionary and proactive in helping this community recover?
I would jump and say it's the latter. In my experience, the folks that haven't experienced direct loss of historic resources have seen, and now they're like, yeah, part of the issue that I've got in the western part of the state is that we're very poorly surveyed. And what has been surveyed was like, ye old 1976 bicentennial surveys. So it's old, it's sparse, and, it's dreadfully needed new surveying. Maybe the 250th will bring this whole wave of that happening. But that's been a big part of it. And the folks that have gone through this event have really developed a keener awareness of the value of historic and cultural resources and their loss.
Just to speak to that point with Jack, it's interesting when City of LA did their survey, citywide survey, part of the rationale for that, and whether they really thought about it or not, but it was stated, was it would be useful at the time of disaster. And it certainly has proved helpful, and to have an up-to-date survey. And I think it shows the gap when that doesn't exist.
I think the survey work we've been doing has been one of the things that we weren't sure what it was going to turn into. But I think it's been really meaningful to the community to have us doing that. So we've now surveyed 1,200 structures that hadn't been surveyed previously. And I think it's meant a lot to those communities. It's shown the importance of their community. It's shown that we care about what was there. And what's potentially lost. We had our architectural historian write an article about a neighborhood that had never really been documented before, a mill village, that, you know, we've already seen a lot of demolitions in since the storm. And so I think that's been really meaningful for people, and it's been how we've been able to contribute in communities that have previously been underserved by preservation. The other thing I'd say about the welcome we get from people is, I think that sometimes people are scared of preservation because they have a sense that somebody's going to come in and tell them what they can do with their house, right? And they don't necessarily want that. And normally we very much consider ourselves an advocacy organization. In this circumstance, we've sort of stepped back from that a bit. We are not having, you know, arguments with people that are just demolishing places that were damaged by the storm. We're focusing all of our energy into people that are trying to rehabilitate buildings. And so, we make sure that they know resources are available if they would rather not demolish, but I think that's sort of helped that perception as well for us.
That's so interesting. So I know, as someone, you know, watching from afar what was happening in LA and what was happening in Western North Carolina, just with horror, you know, the immediate question that pops in my mind is, how can I help? And of course, being a preservation professional, I immediately think of your organizations. So do you find that there is a meaningful way? I mean, does it help when someone logs on and donates $50, or what is it, you know, or just sends you a note saying they're thinking of you, you know, in these critical days after a horrible disaster? What really makes a big impact for you all who are boots on the ground?
Absolutely, there are great organizations to support in all of these areas, I know. Certainly, we welcome anybody's financial support. It's been expensive to try and participate in helping, and the more, you know, the more we have, the more we're able to put back into the community. There's other great organizations. Mana Food Bank is a great one here. Beloved is another nonprofit here that's focusing on getting people back in homes and rebuilding new homes for people that their homes were lost. And then the other thing I keep telling people is Asheville's still a great place to visit. Western North Carolina is beautiful. There are parts of Asheville that are really decimated, but if you went to our downtown, you would never know that there was a storm, right? So come here, visit here, support the businesses that have relocated, the businesses. We need all of it right now. So
I would just add to that is that recovery is not a 3 month, 6 month, 1 year, 2 year. It's a long-term game, which we're used to that in preservation. We always play the long game, but having the resources to sustain these efforts, I think, is really critical. Whether it's creating a grant program or, you know, handing out dehumidifiers, whatever is needed for the response, I think is critical. And none of us planned for this, which goes back to a much bigger issue around, you know, climate change and, you know, these once in a lifetime kind of natural disasters, or we hope that they're not more than that. But, you know, it certainly has upended my schedule and other schedules, you know, in terms of what I thought I was going to be doing this year is very different, and didn't plan for that. So I think it's, you know, it's certainly having that support and also thinking about how people see us as a part of the recovery. And I do believe preservation needs to be at the table. It's not always there. Maybe, as Jack said at the beginning, we shouldn't be there right from the start, but we are part of the long-term kind of rebuilding recovery process. The other piece I would say is, you know, the philanthropic community, however they can help, and it's broadly in terms of the kind of services that are needed in terms of these kind of recoveries. And again, I can't emphasize enough the sustaining long term, because I always worry, we're 3 months in, what's the news cycle before the next thing? And people forget, like maybe people are already forgetting, you know, in North Carolina, how much longer do we have in LA before they've moved on to the next thing?
Hans, did you have a comment?
I was just going to add, I would really echo what Jesse said. I mean, we do this work at the end of the day because we're very evangelical about place and what, you know, the kinds of joy that place can bring to people's lives. We wouldn't do this work if we didn't have a deep belief in the beauty of these places that we live. So I think just it's hard to visit Altadena right now. There's not a lot to do. But look at it as a disaster zone, but look at it too as a beautiful place that's worth your time and worth your eyeballs. I'd also echo what Adrian said. We lost our house, and of everyone who reached out to me, one of my typical responses was, "It's so great to hear from you. Thanks for reaching out. Check back with me in 6 months, check back with me in a year." It's very, very much a long game and shifts by the day. To other people out there, if I can make one plug, I think a huge part of this work is storytelling. There is a history of Altadena. It's a book by Michelle Zach. She's a local Altadenan. It is called Altadena Between Wilderness and City. The Altadena Historical Society, which is an older organization than Altadena Heritage, has the copyright to that book, and they very, very much want to bring it back into print. It is the definitive history of Altadena. I think it is certainly the book I wish I would have written, but I don't think a better book will be written. And so to the extent I can make any kind of pitch, it's not even an Altadena Heritage pitch. Altadena Historical Society, they are fundraising. They want to reprint Michelle Zach's Altadena Between Wilderness and City, and we would love to get that done.
Yeah, printing books is an amazing way of, really making sure people understand heritage no matter what happens moving forward. I mean, it seems old school, but it's very important. Jesse.
One comment, to Jack's point earlier, he mentioned the emotional toll that this has taken on everybody in these areas. And here we've talked about how you should come visit, you should support and all of that. We're fragile. We're fragile in these communities right now. And I think that's really important, is come here, visit us, spend your money in these communities, support these organizations. But people here have been through a lot, and absolutely in LA as well.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
I think that there's a component of that needs to be thought of as well.
I think that was a huge conversation in Maui following the
right, exactly.
They desperately needed the income to, support their community, but they, needed people to be respectful in terms of how they enjoyed themselves on these sites where people had just lost everything. And to that point, we're almost out of time, but there is a really interesting question here from Tara, who says, after the fires in Maui, I saw on the news that developers have tried to come in and buy out lots and homes from those who have lost everything. Has this been happening in your cities? Is there a way preservationists can fight against this so that communities can remain in the hands of people and not outside developers?
I can speak a little bit. There are some early efforts of community land banking to try to buy up some lots where people, they have to sell, they don't have the ability to rebuild, which you understand it's a personal decision for everybody. But that's a hard one to get around and address in terms of the speculative development market. And that's happening both in the Palisades and Altadena already in terms of prices, properties going on the market. But there is some effort to try to counter that.
Funny, because that's something we've been really concerned about here. And then on the flip side, in a couple of cases, I'm aware of historic structures that are owned locally that they are looking for outside investors in hopes that somebody can save a building that they cannot afford to save. So that's been an interesting twist that probably should have been on my list of things that I didn't expect. I don't know how people will feel about that 3, 5, 10 years down the road. But I know that there are people who are saying, I want to save my historic structure and I can't without support. So it's kind of been a surprise.
Yeah, I think if I can just add, I think much of the solution there is also, or can be, just individual help with individual people. I mean, some people, and look, I'd even put myself in this category, have a very hard time understanding a term I learned this weekend, the capital stack, meaning you've got insurance, you've got a potential SBA loan, you've got this, you've got that, you've got a rebuild process to envision over the next 3 years. Of course, there's the larger scale political and economic question, sort of community-wide, but there's also just how do you help this one person who doesn't understand on a basic level how they can maintain their house and not be forced to sell.
I know we're getting short on time. We're working to try to enhance the relationships that we have with our municipal governments and the administrations, because we anticipate a wave of code enforcement issues from abandonment, and how we can integrate Preservation North Carolina's endangered properties program. You know, we are a transactional real estate type of organization. We have been for decades, to help save some of those places as well, but also doing it in a sensitive way, and not causing a ripple effect of upset through the local marketplace.
Great. That is, I just don't want to, we are at 3 o'clock, so I just wanted to make sure everyone had their space to say what they need to say for the last question. So thank you all for being here. I just have a few closing announcements. Let me just share the screen real quick. So we really, really appreciate you coming here. As always, the National Trust has a number of different things going on that we'd like to invite you to attend if you can. This September, we are going to be in Milwaukee for Pass Forward. And then we actually just announced on November 5th, we'll be having our National Preservation Law Conference. And so the links for both of those are here. And then our next webinar is actually one we're doing in partnership with the National Council on Public History and the Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation Organization. And it's a AAPI Digital Public History Project Showcase, where we have 6 really incredible organizations that you might not know about, but you might know about, sharing some of the work they're doing to tell Asian and Pacific Islander history as part of the Heritage Month in May. And then finally, as many of you have probably heard, it is the National Trust's 75th anniversary. And so I am here to make the ask that if you like what you heard today, in addition to supporting these amazing organizations that you see on screen, and you're moved to contribute to the National Trust, there are 2 ways you can do that: through the /support link, or if you have a donor advice fund, through that as well. But regardless, we do appreciate you being here today, and thank you so much. I know there were questions in the Q&A section that we didn't even get to. I'm so glad we had this robust conversation though, so I'm not really sad about that. But I'm gonna look at the questions, and I know there's some very specific to LA and some very specific to Asheville. And if Jesse and Adrian have time, we'll, and Hans and Jack, we'll send it to them so they can respond when they can. I know they're very busy, so, but I'll just make sure that they get into your hot little hands to answer. Other than that, thank you so much for being here. And if you are looking for anything, the recordings will be on our YouTube channel, and you will get the recording in your inbox with the email you used to register in about 24 hours. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you all so much for this conversation and for taking time out of what is your very busy schedules to share your experiences. Thank you.